In the heart of a quiet American suburb, the Lawson family appeared to live the kind of life that many aspired to. Their modest two-story home sat on a neatly trimmed street where neighbors waved from across lawns and children rode their bicycles without fear. To anyone passing by, theirs was a picture of normalcy, the kind of family that fit neatly into the storybook idea of stability. Inside the Lawson home, warmth radiated from the kitchen. It was a late spring evening, one of those days when the air still carried the gentle coolness of early May, but with just enough warmth to hint at summer's approach. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken, buttered rolls, and fresh herbs. For Patricia Lawson, known simply as Patty to her friends, dinners like this represented more than a meal. They were her anchor, the moment she brought her husband and children together, carving out time from the chaos of modern life to sit across from one another and talk. Patty was 42, a devoted mother who had spent years balancing her job at the local library with her role at home. She had the kind of presence that drew people in, gentle eyes, an easy smile, and a patience that made her both a trusted friend and a beloved mother. She prided herself on being steady. Dinner, for her, wasn't just a routine. It was her ritual, her way of keeping everyone grounded. Her husband, David, was in his mid-40s, a man of few words but steady in his responsibilities. He worked as a regional manager for a construction supply company, which meant long hours and frequent travel. To neighbors, he seemed dedicated, perhaps a bit distant, but never outwardly unkind. At the dinner table, he was the silent observer, listening more than speaking, letting Patty fill the air with her questions and stories. Their children, Emily and Jacob, were the heart of Patty's world. Emily, 16, was thoughtful and quietly ambitious, often with a book in hand or earbuds tucked into her ears. She was a girl who straddled the line between adolescence and adulthood, testing boundaries yet still tethered to the safety of home. Jacob, only 10, carried the carefree energy of youth. He was full of questions, always moving, always curious, the kind of boy who could fill silence with laughter. That evening, the family gathered around their oak dining table as they had so many times before. The setting sun cast a golden hue across the room, filtering through sheer curtains and softening the edges of everything it touched. Plates clinked as food was passed, voices overlapped with the ease of familiarity, and for a while it felt like nothing in the world could disturb the comfort of that moment. Patty asked Emily about her upcoming exams, gently encouraging without pressing too hard. She reminded Jacob to slow down as he rushed through his plate, joking that one day he might actually taste the food he devoured. David sat quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a dry but gentle comment that brought a small laugh from the children. It was, in every sense, an ordinary dinner, ordinary enough that no one would have thought twice about it. But sometimes, it is within these ordinary evenings that fate begins to shift in ways no one can see. What no one at the table knew was that this dinner, seemingly so simple and unremarkable, would be remembered not for what was said, but for what came after. In less than 24 hours, their lives would fracture, their normalcy shattered, their story forever marked by an absence that would never fully be explained. As the evening wound down, dishes were cleared, homework was discussed, and bedtime routines fell into place. Patty lingered in the kitchen after the others drifted away, wiping down the counters with the kind of quiet contentment that came from order. She was the kind of woman who found satisfaction in small details, who felt a sense of peace when everything was in its place. To her, these small acts weren't chores but assurances, reminders that her family was safe, that her home was whole. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its own nighttime rhythm. Porch lights flicked on one by one, dogs barked in the distance, and cars slowed as residents returned from late shifts. In houses up and down the block, other families carried out their own rituals of winding down. To each of them, the Lawson home was just another in a row of stable, quiet lives. Nothing stood out. Nothing seemed unusual. But still, there were details that now, in hindsight, would appear with sharper edges. The way David had looked distracted, checking his watch more often than usual. The way Emily had retreated to her room quickly, closing the door behind her, earbuds blocking out the world. The way Jacob had run up the stairs, but then returned to hug his mother one last time before bed, clinging just a little longer than normal. At the time, none of it seemed remarkable. It was life in all its subtle, unnoticed patterns. By 10 o'clock, the Lawson household was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator was the loudest sound, accompanied only by the occasional creak of the settling house. Patty checked the doors and windows, as she always did, making sure everything was locked and secure. She took one last glance at the table, now cleared and spotless, before finally allowing herself to rest. It was the last time the Lawson family would ever share a dinner together. When dawn broke the next day, one of them would be gone. And though no one could have guessed it then, that quiet spring evening meal would become the beginning of a mystery so chilling, so deeply unsettling, that it would haunt the community for years to come. The Lawson home, once filled with warmth and routine, would soon become a place of whispers, speculation, and questions that would never be fully answered. Neighbors would replay their memories of that family, police would comb through every inch of the house, and headlines would spread across the nation. But all of it would trace back to this night, this dinner, this fragile illusion of normal life before the storm. What appeared to be an ordinary family meal would stand forever as the dividing line between before and after. Before the vanishing, before the fear, before the secrets unraveled. And as the Lawson family drifted to sleep that night, they did so unaware that by morning, nothing would ever be the same. The stage is set. An ordinary evening before an extraordinary disappearance. The next chapter will open with the dawning realization that Patty Lawson is missing the first cracks in the illusion of family stability. The Lawson household woke to a silence that felt strangely heavy. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting pale streaks across the walls, but the usual rhythm of breakfast and conversation was missing. The scent of coffee never filled the air. The sound of a mother's footsteps moving between stove and table was absent. Emily was the first to notice. 16 and accustomed to the steady presence of her mother, she found the kitchen empty. The counter, usually arranged with cereal boxes or plates ready for toast, was bare. She assumed her mother had stepped outside, perhaps watering the garden or checking the mailbox. It was unlike her, but not alarming enough to raise immediate concern. Still, the quiet fell off. Jacob bounded down the stairs minutes later, brimming with the energy of a 10-year-old eager to start the day. His voice carried through the rooms as he called for his mother. No answer came. His small footsteps echoed through the hallways as he searched from room to room, his calls growing louder and more uncertain. David entered last, dressed for work, his tie neatly in place. He was a man of routine, and that morning he seemed intent on keeping it. But when his children mentioned they couldn't find their mother, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of confusion, quickly masked by a tone of reassurance. He suggested perhaps she had gone out early for groceries or stepped out for a walk. Yet the explanations didn't settle the unease. Patty never left the house without telling someone. She was meticulous, predictable in her habits. The clock ticked on, minutes stretching longer than usual. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Texts remained unread. By mid-morning, the quiet confidence that she would return began to unravel into dread. Emily's unease turned into tears, Jacob's questions turned into fear, and David's calm facade began to fracture under the weight of absence. The neighbors were the next to notice. Mrs. Parker from across the street saw the children on the porch, their anxious faces scanning the driveway as though expecting their mother's car to appear. Soon whispers began. Patty was well known on the block, a friendly presence, always quick with a wave or smile. For her to vanish without explanation was unthinkable. By noon, David called the police. His voice carried the tension of a man unsure whether he was overreacting or facing something unimaginable. Officers arrived quickly, taking notes, asking questions, moving through the house with quiet professionalism. They checked her closet, her purse, her keys. Nothing was missing. It was as though she had evaporated from within the walls of her own home. The children clung to each other as uniformed men and women walked through the familiar spaces of their lives. Bedrooms were examined, windows inspected, doors tested. Officers asked about arguments, about unusual behavior, about any sign that Patty might have chosen to leave on her own. The answers were the same from everyone, no. She was content, present, devoted. She would never have walked away. The longer she remained missing, the more the atmosphere shifted. The Lawson home, once ordinary, took on an unfamiliar weight. Each room felt altered, as though the absence had carved out a hollow space that could not be filled. Every sound was sharper, every shadow longer, every unanswered question heavier. By evening, search efforts were underway. Flyers were printed, neighbors joined in knocking on doors, and local volunteers combed the nearby park and wooded areas. Strangers who had once passed by the Lawson house without thought now lingered on the sidewalks, watching the unfolding scene with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The community, so used to safety, found itself shaken. If someone like Patty could disappear without trace, then no one was immune. Parents held their children tighter. Doors were locked earlier. Conversations at grocery stores and gas stations circled back to the same question. Where was she? Inside the Lawson home, the atmosphere fractured. Emily withdrew into herself, clutching her mother's sweater as though it could provide answers. Jacob asked questions his father could not answer, questions that only grew harder as the hours stretched on. David moved mechanically, answering police inquiries, making phone calls, offering reassurances he did not seem to believe himself. When night fell again, the house was unbearably still. The absence was no longer just noticed. It was undeniable in a way that left everyone unsettled. Beds felt too large. Meals went untouched, the rhythm of life disrupted by a silence that carried with it the echo of something dark and unfinished. Patty Lawson had vanished after dinner. No note, no trace, no explanation. A woman who had dedicated her life to creating stability for those around her was now the source of the most profound instability they had ever known. The questions were just beginning, and the answers, when they came, would prove to be far darker than anyone dared to imagine. The search for Patricia Lawson quickly transformed from a missing persons alert into a full-scale investigation. What began as unanswered calls and unanswered questions evolved into a case that demanded the attention of every detective in the local precinct. By the second day of her disappearance, the Lawson home was no longer simply a residence. It had become a crime scene. Investigators started with the basics, combing through the details of her last known movements. She had been seen at dinner, engaged in the ordinary tasks of a mother, preparing food, laughing at her children's stories, clearing dishes. After that, nothing. No witnesses placed her outside the home, no cameras caught her leaving, and no trace of her appeared beyond that kitchen. For detectives, this detail was chilling. Disappearances often came with trails, footprints, surveillance footage, credit card charges, calls to friends. In Patty's case, there was nothing but silence. The house itself became the first focus. Forensic teams entered with gloves and equipment, dusting for fingerprints, photographing every corner, bagging even the smallest objects for evidence. Floors were checked for unusual stains, walls for dents or scratches. They cataloged items in the trash, combed through laundry baskets and search drawers. It was a meticulous process, one designed to catch the smallest anomaly that might reveal a larger truth. Yet the deeper they searched, the more confounding the situation became. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no broken locks, no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass. The home gave the impression of safety, yet the very heart of it, Patty herself, was gone. Investigators turned next to the family. In every disappearance, those closest are examined first. David Lawson became a subject of quiet scrutiny. His account of the evening was consistent. Dinner together, children sent to bed, a quiet night. He claimed he fell asleep in the living room, only to wake the next morning to find his wife missing. Detectives noted his calm tone, his careful phrasing. They noted, too, that calmness could be read two ways. as the composure of a man keeping control in crisis, or as the restraint of someone hiding deeper truths. Emily and Jacob were questioned in age-appropriate ways. Emily, withdrawn and tense, repeated that she went to bed after dinner and heard nothing unusual. Jacob, younger and less guarded, admitted he woke in the night and thought he heard footsteps downstairs, but when asked if he was sure, he hesitated. Children's memories could be fragile, and investigators recorded every detail, knowing even the smallest recollection could prove vital later. The neighborhood became the next layer of inquiry. Officers knocked on doors, canvassing for information. Neighbors described Patty as reliable, devoted, and steady. None recalled seeing her after the previous evening, none noticed unusual cars on the street, and none heard disturbances overnight. A few remembered the family dog barking around midnight, but most dismissed it as ordinary. In hindsight, however, investigators wondered if that moment marked something far from ordinary. Digital forensics followed. Investigators pulled records from her phone, her email, her social media accounts. The last outgoing message was a simple one to a colleague at the library, a reminder about an upcoming book drive. Nothing in tone suggested fear, distress, or plans to leave. No phone calls hinted at secret meetings. No emails hinted at plans beyond the ordinary. The clean digital footprint, while seemingly innocuous, raised unease. People rarely disappear without leaving some form of trace. For investigators, the absence of activity was almost as telling as the presence of it. Attention turned to David's movements. Phone records placed him at home that night, but questions lingered. Had the marriage been strained? Were there financial troubles? Investigators probed bank statements, discovering no large withdrawals, no hidden accounts. The family's finances seemed stable, the picture of middle-class security. Still, detectives knew that surface appearances often concealed more complicated truths. As days passed without a lead, tension grew. News stations picked up the story, broadcasting Patty's image across the region. Her face appeared on posters, in newspapers, on social media timelines. Interviews with neighbors painted her as the woman next door, a figure of trust and kindness. The growing coverage brought tips, but few proved useful. Some claimed to see her at gas stations or highways, but none could be verified, each dead and chipped away at hope, leaving only frustration. Inside the investigation team, quiet debates unfolded. Some believed she had chosen to leave, perhaps burdened by invisible struggles. Others pointed to the evidence, or lack thereof, suggesting something more sinister had occurred within her home. Patterns from other cases lingered in the minds of detectives. Spouses hiding secrets, domestic disputes that escalated, carefully concealed violence. Yet, nothing concrete tied David or anyone else to wrongdoing. It was on the fourth day that a subtle discovery shifted the investigation's focus. In the laundry room, beneath a pile of clothes, forensic technicians found a small smear on the floor, faint, nearly invisible, but enough to raise alarm. Tests later confirmed it as blood. While the amount was small, it raised chilling questions. Whose blood was it? How had it gotten there? And why had it not been reported? David explained that laundry was Patty's responsibility, and he hadn't noticed the mark. He suggested it might have been from a minor cut, nothing unusual in a household. But investigators weren't convinced. The stain's placement, its near invisibility, and its discovery only through careful examination suggested otherwise. With this clue, attention tightened. The search widened to include cadaver dogs, who were brought into the house and yard. They moved methodically, their handlers watching for signs of alert. In certain parts of the basement, the dogs hesitated, noses pressed against the floor, bodies tense. It was not confirmation, but it was enough to deepen suspicion. The children were moved temporarily to stay with relatives, a precaution as the house became increasingly dominated by investigators. The sight of patrol cars outside, of yellow tape strung across the driveway, of strangers in uniforms carrying evidence bags, these became the new reality of the Lawson home. By the end of the first week, the community was gripped. Rumors spread through whispered conversations. Some speculated she had run away, others whispered darker possibilities. Trust fractured. Where once the Lawsons were seen as a normal family, now they were the subject of suspicion. Every look, every memory, every story about them was dissected. For detectives, the case had reached a turning point. The evidence was thin, the trail cold, yet the faint traces, the blood, the hesitant alerts from the dogs, the absence of any external leads, suggested the answers lay not outside the Lawson home, but within it. The house, outwardly ordinary, concealed something hidden. The kind of hidden truth that would only come to light with time, patience, and persistence. And as the days stretched into nights and the questions outnumbered the answers, the unsettling reality settled in. Whatever happened to Patricia Lawson had not happened by chance. The investigation is now formally underway. Subtle discoveries begin pointing toward the home itself, with the first ominous traces that something darker lies beneath the surface. As the investigation pressed further into the details of Patricia Lawson's life, the image of a perfect suburban family began to erode. On the surface, the Lawsons appeared ordinary. A steady job for the husband, a loving mother at the center of the home, 2 children growing within the expected patterns of their ages. Yet, investigators knew that appearances often served as fragile shells, and behind the calm exterior of many households, darker truths lingered. Detectives began their deeper dive by interviewing those who knew Patricia most intimately. Friends from the library described her as dependable, compassionate, and calm under pressure. Yet, several noted that, in the months leading up to her disappearance, she had seemed distracted. At times, her mind appeared elsewhere, as though carrying a burden she never spoke of. A close co-worker admitted that Patty had once hinted she felt unseen in her own home, though she never elaborated further. To many, it seemed a vague comment. But to investigators, it signaled possible tension beneath the carefully crafted image of marital stability. Attention shifted toward David. Co-workers described him as efficient, but emotionally distant. They noted he rarely spoke of his wife, and when he did, it was often in practical terms rather than affectionate ones. A few recalled moments where he seemed irritable, snapping when stressed, though none could remember outright hostility. Yet detectives took note. A pattern of detachment, a quiet distance, could often serve as the backdrop for conflicts hidden behind closed doors. The children's accounts deepened the mystery. Emily, thoughtful and restrained, told investigators that her parents had occasional arguments. She described them not as violent, but sharp, marked by long silences afterward. She admitted she often retreated to her room when voices grew tense, preferring not to witness the discord. Jacob, with the innocence of a younger child, mentioned that sometimes Mom cried at night, though he could not explain why. His words carried the raw honesty of youth, a reminder that children often sense what adults attempt to conceal. In the family's digital world, investigators uncovered more fragments. On Patricia's personal laptop, her search history revealed late-night inquiries into topics like how to protect assets, separation agreements, and how to tell your children. Though she had shared no such plans with friends or family, these searches suggested she may have been contemplating leaving her marriage. The possibility shifted the lens of the case. If she had intended to separate, had her decision escalated tensions within the household? Or had she disappeared as part of an attempt to start anew? The evidence was ambiguous, but the timing, so close to her vanishing, was troubling. Detectives then revisited the small but critical clue discovered in the laundry room. The bloodstain, though faint, became the anchor of suspicion. Forensic testing confirmed it belonged to Patricia. While the amount was not enough to suggest a fatal injury, its very presence in a concealed location raised haunting questions. It contradicted the idea that she had simply walked away. Something had happened to her inside the home. The absence of larger signs of struggle did not diminish the weight of that single trace. It suggested an event carefully hidden, an attempt to erase evidence that had not been entirely successful. Neighbors, when questioned again, began to remember details that seemed insignificant at the time, but carried new weight in hindsight. One recalled hearing what sounded like a thud during the night of her disappearance, though she dismissed it then as someone moving furniture. Another noted seeing David taking garbage bags to the curb earlier than usual that week, his expression tense. Small fragments, scattered across multiple witnesses, began forming the outline of something darker. The media coverage intensified, and with it came scrutiny. Commentators speculated on air about the possibility of domestic conflict. Online forums buzzed with theories ranging from abduction by strangers to calculated foul play. The Lawson name became a topic of fascination, their private lives dissected by strangers who knew nothing of their true reality. For the children, this intrusion was devastating. Emily refused to go to school, unable to bear the stares and whispers. Jacob grew quiet, his once boundless energy dimmed by the weight of fear. For investigators, the case had become a balancing act between evidence and conjecture. They lacked the conclusive proof needed to accuse anyone, yet the subtle threads kept pulling them inward, back to the family itself. They wondered if Patty's disappearance was the culmination of long-simmering tension, a final act of desperation or rage hidden within the walls of her home. Financial records revealed another fracture. Though their overall accounts seemed stable, there were irregularities in David's credit card use. Charges at bars and hotels, some in nearby towns, suggested he may have been leading a life his family knew little about. When confronted, he claimed these were work-related expenses, dismissing any suggestion of infidelity. But investigators noted the timing, the pattern of secrecy, and the likelihood that Patty may have known more than she had ever revealed to others. The basement of the Lawson home drew increasing attention. The alerts from cadaver dogs lingered in the minds of detectives. They returned with ground-penetrating radar, scanning for disturbances beneath the concrete floor. The results showed irregular patches, as though parts of the foundation had been altered. Though not conclusive, it added yet another layer of suspicion. Why would portions of the basement show signs of recent change? The possibility of concealment loomed, though no body had yet been found. The more investigators uncovered, the more the perfect facade of the Lawsons unraveled. To neighbors, they had been the family who waved from the driveway, who hosted barbecues, who blended seamlessly into the suburban rhythm. But beneath the surface were threads of discontent, quiet arguments, private tears, secret searches on a laptop, unexplained stains, irregular financial behavior. Each discovery deepened the portrait of a family less whole than it had appeared. For the community, the shift was jarring. Sympathy for the family's loss became entangled with suspicion toward David. Friends who once defended him now avoided eye contact, unsure what to believe. Every action he took, his tone at press conferences, his composure in interviews, his decisions in the days after the disappearance, was analyzed under the harsh lens of doubt. He became both a grieving husband and a potential suspect in the court of public opinion. Through it all, Patricia's absence loomed. Her face on posters and news broadcasts served as a haunting reminder that a woman's life had been interrupted in the most unnatural way. She had been the steady presence, the caretaker, the one who wove the family together. Now, her silence was the loudest voice in the story, echoing through every corner of the investigation. By the end of the second week, investigators faced a grim reality. They were no longer searching for a missing woman. They were uncovering the secrets of a fractured household. What had once been hidden beneath smiles and routines was now exposed under the relentless glare of inquiry. And as evidence slowly stacked against the image of innocence, the looming question grew heavier. Had the disappearance of Patricia Lawson been the result of a stranger's cruelty, or had the darkest betrayal come from within her own home? The investigation has begun peeling away the surface image of the Lawson family, revealing conflicts, secrets, and evidence suggesting foul play within the home. The following days stretched into a blur of relentless searching and emotional strain. With every hour that passed without a lead, the family's desperation deepened, and the once orderly rhythms of their lives crumbled under the weight of uncertainty. The house itself seemed to absorb the tension, each room echoing with absence, the silence growing heavier with every night that ended without resolution. Police patrols expanded their reach, combing nearby woodlands, riversides, and rural roads. Flyers with Margaret's photograph were plastered on shop windows, gas stations, and bus stops. Her warm smile, frozen in an image meant for family albums, now stared back from every corner of the town, accompanied by the chilling words, "Missing mother of 3." Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, their once casual greetings replaced with nervous glances, as though fear itself had moved in among them. Despite the tireless efforts, no solid lead emerged. Calls poured into the station, each one hinting at a sighting, a detail, a possibility, but every promising clue dissolved under scrutiny. A woman matching Margaret's description scene at a gas station turned out to be a traveler passing through. A car parked by the woods, initially suspicious, belonged to a hiker. Each dead end chipped away at the family's hope, leaving behind a raw mixture of dread and exhaustion. Inside the household, the weight of Margaret's absence reshaped their lives. Daniel juggled between keeping the children's routines intact and working closely with investigators. Nights grew longer, his thoughts cycling endlessly between despair and determination. The children, once bright with their mother's presence, dimmed with confusion. The youngest often asked when their mother would be back, clinging to the belief that she would walk through the door at any moment. Their questions pierced deeper than any investigative dead end, forcing Daniel to shield them with reassurances he himself no longer fully believed. As the days grew into weeks, the investigation shifted from the initial assumption of a voluntary disappearance to something darker. The lack of communication from Margaret, the absence of financial activity, and the sheer abruptness of her vanishing began to erode any suggestion that she had left by choice. Detectives started scrutinizing every detail of her personal life, piecing together fragments of who she was beyond the role of a mother and wife. Her workplace colleagues described her as dedicated but private, someone who carried her burdens quietly. Friends painted her as reliable and caring, but in recent months, they noticed a change, subtle moments of distraction, shadows of worry in her smile, as if something unspoken was weighing her down. These revelations added complexity to the picture. Beneath the veneer of family life, there had been undercurrents, tensions perhaps unnoticed until it was too late. Detectives combed through her digital footprint, hoping for a trail. Her phone records revealed routine patterns, calls with family, texts with friends, work-related emails. But then, in the weeks before her disappearance, there were gaps, long silences during hours when she was usually active. No unusual numbers appeared, yet the absence itself felt significant. On her social media, the cheerful posts stopped abruptly days before she vanished, a silence that mirrored her physical disappearance. The family home became both a sanctuary and a crime scene. Investigators returned repeatedly, searching for overlooked evidence. Every corner was examined, from attic to basement, every belonging cataloged. Forensic teams scoured the kitchen, the last place she had been seen, taking swabs, dusting surfaces, analyzing fibers. To the family, this invasion felt both hopeful and violating, as though their grief was on display under bright investigative lights. Meanwhile, media interest escalated. News crews parked outside the house, microphones thrust forward with relentless questions. Headlines speculated on every angle: a devoted mother vanishing without trace, possible foul play, hidden secrets. Strangers on the internet spun theories, dissecting her life from afar, amplifying every detail into sinister possibilities. Daniel found himself portrayed both as a grieving husband and, inevitably, as a person of interest under public scrutiny. The glare of suspicion intensified his isolation, making it harder to maintain composure for his children. At night, when the house fell into uneasy quiet, Daniel replayed every moment of that dinner, searching for something he had missed. He recalled the clinking of cutlery, the conversation about mundane family matters, the laughter that now felt like an echo from another life. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet within minutes she had walked out of the room and into nothingness. The ordinariness of that final scene tormented him, as though the absence of drama concealed something far more chilling. Weeks turned into a month and then another. The investigation, though active, slowed under the weight of limited leads. Search parties dwindled, volunteers returned to their routines, and the community's focus shifted to other matters. For the family, however, time only deepened the wound. Birthdays passed with empty chairs at the table, school events marked by her absence, daily life stitched together by fragile endurance. Then, a discovery reignited the case. Several miles away, in a remote wooded area, hikers stumbled upon a piece of fabric partially buried under leaves. The color and texture matched a blouse Margaret had been wearing the night she disappeared. The find was rushed to forensic labs, where tests confirmed it bore traces of her DNA. Alongside it, investigators noted scuff marks in the soil, disturbed earth that suggested more than mere coincidence. This breakthrough brought a chilling new perspective. The wooded location was isolated, far from routes she would normally take. It suggested she had been moved there, perhaps against her will. The family's fragile hope that she had left by choice, that she might return, was shaken to its core. The evidence pointed toward a darker truth, one that had been feared but never spoken aloud. Detectives now leaned heavily toward foul play. Questions sharpened. Who had last seen her? Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Every relationship, every interaction in her final days came under renewed scrutiny. The once casual observations of friends and neighbors transformed into critical details, each memory dissected for inconsistencies. The discovery of the fabric reignited public interest, the media seizing on the ominous development. Speculation swirled with greater intensity, theories multiplying in the absence of concrete answers. The family found themselves once again under the spotlight, their grief becoming a public spectacle. Yet within that noise, one truth grew clearer. The disappearance was no longer a mystery of choice, but one of crime. For Daniel and the children, the revelation shattered any lingering illusions. The fragile threads of hope that Margaret might return unscathed gave way to a heavier realization. Someone had taken her from them. The search for answers became not just about finding her, but about uncovering who had crossed that line, who had stepped into their lives and rewritten them with violence. As investigators dug deeper, the community braced itself. The woman who had once been a familiar presence at school events, grocery aisles, and neighborhood gatherings was no longer just missing. She was the victim of something far more sinister. And the truth they all feared might lie much closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. The trail, now more urgent than ever, was pulling them toward revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about Margaret's disappearance. And as the fifth chapter of this haunting story closed, the family and investigators stood on the edge of truths darker than they could have imagined, with the promise of even deeper secrets waiting to be unearthed. As the search stretched into its second week, the once polite whispers in the town grew sharper, turning into pointed questions that the Carter family could no longer avoid. On the surface, Michael continued to play the role of the desperate husband, pleading with the public for help. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior, cracks began to form. Those who had admired him for years, his neighbors, his co-workers, even his own relatives, were now looking at him through a different lens. The charm that once seemed effortless was starting to look like a mask, and people wondered what he might be hiding behind it. Investigators noticed the same shift. What had once looked like the portrait of a grieving husband began to appear rehearsed, too polished for someone supposedly broken by the disappearance of his wife. His words in front of the cameras were always perfectly measured, but when he thought no one was watching, his body language betrayed a certain distance, almost as if he were merely playing a role in a tragedy rather than living it. Detectives dug deeper into Michael's life, searching for clues that could explain the growing suspicions. It was during this phase of the investigation that they uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Financial records showed that, despite maintaining the image of stability, Michael was drowning in debt. The house that had always seemed so secure was in danger of foreclosure. Bills had been piling up, and large withdrawals from their joint account had left unexplained gaps. At the same time, coworkers quietly confided to investigators that Michael's behavior at the office had changed drastically in the months before Claire's disappearance. He had been seen taking long lunches, often in the company of a woman no one at the office seemed to know well. When pressed for details, people admitted they suspected he might be having an affair, though no one had been willing to confront him directly. For years, he had played the role of the devoted husband, so convincingly that even those closest to him were hesitant to believe what they had witnessed. As detectives pieced these fragments together, a darker image of Michael began to form. His debt, his possible affair, and his coldness behind the scenes all pointed to a man who might not have been as devoted as he pretended. Investigators also noticed a troubling detail. Michael had failed to mention that his life insurance policy for Claire had been increased significantly just 6 months before her disappearance. He claimed it had been for their children's security, but the timing was difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, the children remained at the heart of the unfolding storm. Their innocent voices carried a weight that no detective could dismiss. The oldest, Emily, started to ask questions in front of others, teachers, neighbors, even reporters, about why her father seemed so calm when her mother was missing. Those questions echoed what many adults were too cautious to say aloud. To Emily, it seemed incomprehensible that her father wasn't searching every street and knocking on every door. Instead, she watched him attend interviews, maintain his posture, and make carefully chosen statements to the public. The community, once united in sympathy, began to fracture. Some still rallied around Michael, clinging to the belief that a family man like him could never harm his wife. Others, however, started to distance themselves, unwilling to ignore the mounting inconsistencies. Where neighbors once brought food and support, now there were silences, hushed conversations behind curtains, and lingering glances whenever Michael appeared in public. It was during this tense period that investigators uncovered a critical detail that changed the course of the investigation. Security footage from a gas station on the outskirts of town revealed Michael's car late on the night of Claire's disappearance. This directly contradicted his earlier statement that he had been home all evening. When confronted with the footage, Michael gave a vague explanation about needing a drive to clear his head, but his story didn't match the time frame investigators had meticulously pieced together. The footage itself did not show Claire, nor did it prove anything definitive, but it marked the first undeniable crack in Michael's alibi. Once the investigators presented this to the public, the perception of Michael shifted dramatically. What had once seemed like speculation now began to feel like proof, and people could no longer ignore the possibility that he had orchestrated something far more sinister than anyone wanted to believe. In the midst of this, Claire's closest friends stepped forward with their own accounts. They recalled conversations with her in which she confided about growing tensions at home. She had never directly accused Michael of violence, but she spoke of control, how he managed the finances, made decisions without her input, and dismissed her concerns. More disturbingly, some friends claimed she hinted at wanting to leave him, though she had never said it outright. She worried about what would happen to the children, about whether she would have the resources to support them, and about how Michael might react if she ever voiced the desire to walk away. These testimonies painted an image of a woman who felt trapped, torn between the life she had built and the quiet fear of what leaving might cost her. For investigators, this gave new weight to the theory that Claire's disappearance was not random. If she had truly been planning to leave, Michael might have seen it as a threat not only to his pride, but also to his already crumbling financial stability. The revelation further divided the community. To some, it cemented their growing belief that Michael had orchestrated his wife's disappearance. To others, it seemed like an unfair attack on a man already broken by tragedy. Yet, regardless of opinion, the whispers became shouts, and Michael's once pristine reputation was now under siege. At this stage of the investigation, one thing was certain: the perfect family image the Carters had cultivated was shattered. Behind the white picket fence and the polished smiles lay secrets darker than anyone had dared to imagine. The carefully maintained facade of a stable, happy household was nothing more than a fragile illusion. And as investigators continued to dig deeper, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The cracks in Michael's story were widening, and the truth, whatever it might be, was waiting to emerge from the shadows. The search for Claire was no longer just about finding a missing mother. It had become a quest to untangle the secrets of a marriage that was far from what it appeared to be, and to uncover the truth that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. But the closer investigators came, the more dangerous the secrets became, and the realization settled heavily on everyone involved. If Michael had indeed orchestrated Claire's disappearance, he was far more cunning and far more ruthless than anyone had dared to believe. The investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, and what lay ahead promised to shake not only the Carter family, but the entire town to its core. The disappearance had begun as a bewildering mystery that left the community whispering in confusion, but by the time weeks had stretched into months, the air around the case felt suffocating. The family's once ordinary home was now a constant point of reference for neighbors, journalists, and investigators alike. Each day added new details, yet somehow brought no resolution. The sense of unease deepened when private investigators, hired by distant relatives frustrated with the slow official progress, unearthed fragments of truth that painted a picture darker than anyone wanted to believe. The husband's story had begun to fray at the edges. Initially calm and steadfast, his recounting of events slowly revealed inconsistencies. When asked about the evening of his wife's disappearance, he repeated the same sentences as though rehearsed, but tiny discrepancies slipped in when different people questioned him. To the trained ear of seasoned investigators, those cracks stood out. His claim of having gone to bed early and waking to find her missing no longer seemed plausible when neighbors mentioned seeing lights flickering in the house past midnight. One even remembered hearing a car start and idle for several minutes before driving away, though no one could confirm whose it was. Financial records began surfacing, revealing a strain in the family's finances. The seemingly ordinary household had been teetering on the edge of hidden debt, with credit card balances rising and collection agencies circling. These financial woes cast the marriage in a new light. Some wondered whether money troubles had sparked tension severe enough to fracture trust and loyalty within the family. Others whispered that perhaps her disappearance was less about escape and more about silencing secrets. The children, caught in the middle, suffered quietly as suspicion grew heavier around their father. They endured hushed whispers at school, curious stares in the grocery store, and the unshakable shadow of being the family with the missing mother. Each word spoken in town only fueled rumors further. Some pitted the children, seeing them as innocent victims of circumstances beyond their control, while others allowed darker thoughts to take root, wondering if even they might hold secrets too painful to reveal. In the midst of these swirling suspicions, investigators pressed harder into the husband's past. They discovered a pattern of quiet control. Friends of the missing woman revealed that she had grown distant in the months before she vanished, often speaking in half-sentences about feeling stifled, though she never openly accused her husband of wrongdoing. Her journal, found tucked away in a bedside drawer, offered more telling clues. She had written about loneliness, about yearning for freedom, and about the invisible weight of living in a home that looked perfect from the outside, but felt suffocating within. Though there was no outright accusation in her words, the tone spoke volumes to those searching for answers. As investigators pursued these leads, they uncovered a chilling discovery. Phone records showed multiple late-night calls from an unknown number in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Cross-referencing the number revealed it belonged to a man she had once known in college, someone she had briefly reconnected with on social media. Their messages hinted at friendly conversation, but detectives wondered if the relationship had gone further. Was she planning to leave with him? Or was he a lifeline she reached for as her marriage collapsed under unspoken strain? The possibility sent shivers through those piecing together the puzzle. The husband vehemently denied knowing about this contact. He claimed ignorance, insisted that his wife was devoted to their family, and bristled at any suggestion of betrayal. Yet his outrage did little to convince the community that he was entirely innocent. The timing of her vanishing, the debts pressing in, and the growing suspicion that she had one foot out the door painted him as a man desperate enough to act. Whether his desperation was financial, emotional, or rooted in pride became the central question investigators now faced. Meanwhile, the house itself began to feel like a character in the unfolding drama. Each corner was examined, each object scrutinized. Luminol testing revealed faint traces of what might have been blood near the garage, though results were inconclusive. The discovery sent a fresh wave of dread through the town. For the first time, the possibility of violence became more than a whispered theory, it was a tangible fear. Families who once left doors unlocked at night began bolting them tightly. Parents who once waved casually at one another now exchanged wary glances, wondering if darkness lurked closer than anyone imagined. Despite the mounting suspicion, no body had been found, and no definitive evidence linked the husband to foul play. The lack of closure left the case suspended between tragedy and uncertainty. Theories multiplied. Some insisted she had been killed in her own home and hidden away. Others believed she had orchestrated her own disappearance, walking away from family and responsibility to start anew. The conflicting narratives tore at the fabric of trust in the community, leaving everyone unsettled. In the midst of this chaos, another lead emerged. Security footage from a gas station several miles away surfaced, showing a vehicle resembling the family's car driving through late that night. Though the footage was grainy and the license plate unreadable, the timing aligned disturbingly with when neighbors claimed to have heard an engine idling. The possibility that the husband might have moved her body under cover of darkness could no longer be dismissed outright. Yet, without concrete proof, suspicion remained just out of reach of certainty. The children's grandparents grew increasingly concerned and sought custody, fearing that their grandchildren were being raised in a house under too much scrutiny and tension. Legal battles began quietly behind the scenes, further straining what remained of the family unit. For the children, the loss of their mother was already unbearable. Now, they faced the possibility of losing the only parent still present in their daily lives. The community, once united in support, now fractured into factions. Those who sided with the father, insisting on his innocence until proven guilty, and those who believed justice was being delayed. The case had now shifted from a missing persons mystery to a looming battle over truth and perception. As investigators gathered evidence and the family tore itself apart, one fact became clear. The woman's disappearance was not random, nor was it simple. The threads of lies, hidden debts, secrecy, and quiet longing were so tightly interwoven that unraveling them felt impossible. But one truth loomed larger with each passing day. Someone knew exactly what had happened that night, and the web of silence was beginning to tighten. As autumn settled in, leaves falling in nights growing longer, the investigation reached a turning point. Detectives, fueled by the pressure of a restless community and a grieving family, prepared to make their next move. They would soon return to the house with fresh warrants, determined to uncover what had remained hidden within its walls. And while the town braced itself for what might be revealed, a haunting question echoed among them all. Was she out there somewhere alive but silent, or had the home that once seemed safe become her final resting place? The stage was set for revelations that would shatter the fragile balance of suspicion and doubt. The truth, still buried beneath layers of secrecy, was about to claw its way into the light. The discovery of the hidden bank account shattered whatever sense of understanding the Harper family still clung to. Just when they thought they were piecing together answers, this revelation widened the gap between the image they had of their mother and the reality of who she might have been. The bank records revealed large withdrawals, many of them in cash, with no clear trace of where the money had gone. Investigators noted that the transactions had been carried out quietly over the span of months, as if their mother had been preparing for something. To the family, it suggested intent, planning. The word carried weight, heavier than grief, and planted seeds of betrayal deep in their hearts. The children struggled with this most of all. Each had their own version of their mother as the woman who cared for them, who ensured their needs were met, and who sacrificed for their comfort. Yet, the account seemed to betray that image. It hinted that perhaps their mother had been leading a double life, hoarding funds while hiding behind the guise of stability. For the husband, it created a storm of suspicion. If she had been planning to leave, what did that mean for all the years they had spent together? Had their life been a lie? Or worse, was she running from something none of them had yet uncovered? The police, ever cautious with their words, raised the possibility that she may have left willingly. That theory stung. To suggest she had abandoned her family was almost too cruel to accept, but the account, paired with the lack of evidence of abduction, made it difficult to dismiss outright. Still, her family insisted it was not possible. The mother they knew would never leave her children without explanation. To them, the money could have been intended for something else, some private matter she had not yet revealed. Perhaps she was helping someone in secret or paying off a debt she didn't want to burden them with. Yet, with each day passing without contact, their defenses weakened and doubt crept into their voices. The community, once united in sympathy, began to fracture as well. Rumors flourished. Some claimed they had seen her in another town, walking quickly, head down, as if avoiding recognition. Others speculated she had been involved in something darker, perhaps entangled with people who now held her fate in their hands. Social media fed these theories, magnifying every piece of gossip until it blurred the line between truth and fabrication. Neighbors who had once lit candles at vigils now whispered questions about what the family might be hiding. The Harper household, once a sanctuary of normal family life, became a spectacle of speculation. Meanwhile, investigators dug deeper into her phone records, her emails, her social contacts. They found fragments, cryptic messages, half-written drafts, deleted histories that only deepened the mystery. One particular message stood out, a note saved on her phone, unsent, with only a few words typed. "I can't do this anymore." Those words became an anchor for the theory of voluntary disappearance, yet they lacked the clarity to define what she had meant. Was she overwhelmed by family pressures, financial stress, or something unknown to all of them? Or had she been in danger, leaving behind the only trace she dared to? The husband found himself tormented by the possibility that he had missed the signs. He replayed every argument, every quiet moment, every subtle shift in her mood over the past months. Had she been trying to tell him something? Was the distance he sometimes noticed her carrying more than fatigue? The guilt gnawed at him, eroding his certainty. To the outside world, he appeared stoic, but inside he was unraveling. For the children, the confusion turned into tension. They argued, each defending their version of their mother, as though choosing which memory to believe was the only way to survive the chaos. The police escalated their investigation, consulting experts on missing persons who specialized in cases where family members seemed to vanish without violence. They combed through surveillance footage from the surrounding area, tracing her last known movements beyond that dinner. Cameras captured her leaving the restaurant, walking toward her car, but then something chilling emerged. Footage from a street camera showed her driving away alone. This was the last verifiable moment of her existence, and it contradicted the theory of an abduction occurring immediately after dinner. From there, her car vanished, and so did she. The footage raised more questions than answers. If she had driven away willingly, why had she not returned? Why leave her children and her life behind without even a word? And where had she gone? The car became the focus of the search. Law enforcement scoured highways, rivers, and remote areas, seeking any sign of the vehicle. Yet it remained missing, as though it too had disappeared into thin air. This absence fueled speculation of a more sinister fate, perhaps staged to look like a departure, but in reality, ending in something darker. Weeks turned into months, and the search began to exhaust itself. The public's attention drifted to new tragedies, new scandals, leaving the Harper family isolated in their grief and confusion. They lived in limbo, haunted by the unanswered questions, every shadow carrying the possibility of a return, every phone call igniting hope that quickly burned out. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, all marked by an empty chair and the suffocating silence of absence. Still, investigators refused to close the case. They followed faint trails, examined financial patterns, and considered whether someone else had been moving pieces behind the scenes. The hidden account remained their strongest clue, but without knowing where the money had gone, it was a dead end. Theories about coercion gained traction. Perhaps she had been forced to withdraw funds. Perhaps someone had manipulated her into vanishing. The family clung to this possibility, as painful as it was, because it allowed them to believe she had not abandoned them by choice. Yet the other interpretation lingered, unspoken, but always present, that their mother, wife, and anchor had decided she could no longer bear the life she lived, and had chosen to walk away. This possibility was the most devastating of all, because it meant her absence was deliberate and her silence intentional. As the investigation dragged on, the emotional toll on the family became visible. The husband grew gaunt, carrying the weight of suspicion and guilt. The children hardened, their innocence chipped away by the cruel uncertainty of betrayal and loss. The community, once empathetic, distanced itself, treating them as though their tragedy was contagious. By now, whispers suggested that the family themselves might know more than they had admitted. Some wondered if they were covering something up. Others believed they had driven her away. In the quiet of their home, grief turned into resolve. They refused to stop searching, even when official efforts waned. They hired private investigators, launched online campaigns, and clung desperately to any shred of information. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more they realized the truth might be buried in secrets their mother had kept from them all along. And just when the trail seemed cold, just when exhaustion threatened to silence their pursuit, a new lead emerged. One that would shatter everything they thought they knew about her disappearance and force them to confront the darkest possibility yet. The break in the case would come not from the police, not from neighbors, but from a stranger hundreds of miles away, who had no idea their discovery would rip open the story of the mother who vanished after dinner. The investigation had reached a point where the web of secrets began to close in, tightening around those who had once seemed untouchable. By now, the police had gathered enough fragments of evidence to paint a chilling portrait of betrayal, manipulation, and carefully concealed truths. The seemingly ordinary family portrait that neighbors had admired for years had fractured entirely, and what remained beneath was something darker than anyone could have imagined. The disappearance of the mother was no longer viewed as a random act or an accident, but as a deliberate scheme, carefully orchestrated by someone who had not only access to her, but also the strongest motive to silence her. Detectives revisited every detail of the night she vanished. The dinner table, once a symbol of togetherness, had become the epicenter of suspicion. Subtle behaviors, observed by the children, now resurfaced in sharper clarity. A drink poured a little too insistently, a forced smile, the hollow tone of laughter that masked tension. What at first seemed like the ordinary rhythms of family life had, under the scrutiny of hindsight, taken on sinister undertones. Investigators pieced together how long-buried resentments, financial entanglements, and secrets held in whispers had culminated in that fateful night. What became increasingly clear was that the disappearance had not been the result of a stranger lurking outside, nor a random misfortune. It was rooted deeply within the walls of the house itself. The clues kept pointing inward, unraveling a pattern of control, deception, and calculated planning. Surveillance footage from nearby homes had eliminated the possibility of an intruder entering or leaving unnoticed. Financial records revealed sudden and unexplained transfers of money in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, linked to an account hidden under another name. This was not only about someone vanishing, it was about the desperate measures taken to keep truths from surfacing. The family's public image, carefully maintained for years, began to collapse under scrutiny. Friends who once described them as perfect began to recall moments of tension, quiet arguments, and subtle displays of dominance. The husband's influence over household finances, his quiet dismissals of his wife's independence, and his cold efficiency in controlling every major decision started to form a pattern that detectives could no longer ignore. What had once been brushed aside as quirks of a strict man now appeared to be part of a controlling nature that had left his wife isolated and vulnerable. As evidence mounted, whispers in the community grew louder. Neighbors began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal unraveling. The children, once shielded by the illusion of stability, were now pulled into the storm of police interviews, therapy sessions, and media scrutiny. Their lives became punctuated by suspicion and a gnawing uncertainty about the person who had raised them. For them, the hardest truth was not the disappearance itself, but the possibility that the person they had trusted most could be responsible for it. Meanwhile, investigators followed the money trail. The transfers revealed connections to a property purchased discreetly under a different identity. This place, a secluded cabin away from town, became the next focus of the search. The possibility that the missing mother had been taken there, or that evidence of her fate had been concealed within its walls, brought a renewed urgency to the case. Every mile closer to the cabin deepened the anticipation of uncovering what had been hidden for so long. The cabin revealed more than expected. While no trace of the missing woman was immediately apparent, forensic teams uncovered items linked to her, personal belongings she would never have left behind willingly. These discoveries shifted the case from a disappearance to a near certainty of foul play. The once elusive truth was no longer a matter of speculation, it was becoming visible through the careful collection of physical evidence. With the discovery came the unraveling of carefully constructed lies. The husband's alibi began to crumble when placed against timelines drawn from digital data, receipts, and witness statements. His demeanor, once controlled and measured, faltered under questioning. He could no longer maintain the facade of ignorance, not when every piece of evidence chipped away at the story he had so carefully crafted. His desperation grew visible in his inability to explain how his wife's belongings had ended up in a hidden property he had secretly acquired. The children, though devastated, were forced to confront the unthinkable. Memories they had suppressed began to resurface, the uneasy atmosphere at dinner, their mother's hesitant expressions in the weeks before she vanished, her sudden interest in setting aside money of her own. In hindsight, these were signs of a woman preparing for change, perhaps even preparing to leave, and that, investigators believed, may have been the spark that ignited the events of that night. The threat of independence, of secrets being revealed, might have been too much for her husband to bear. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the portrait of betrayal grew sharper. What remained hidden was the final truth of her fate, whether she had been silenced permanently or held somewhere in secret. Every new lead hinted at the darkness of control, a twisted need to dominate not only her life, but also her absence. The chilling realization was that her disappearance was not a crime of passion or an impulsive act. It was meticulously planned, the culmination of years of hidden resentment and control. Yet, despite the weight of evidence, one critical element remained missing: the mother herself. Without her, the case hovered between certainty and speculation. For the children, the absence became unbearable. The idea of closure was a distant hope, constantly slipping away as each discovery brought more questions. They lived in the shadow of doubt, torn between memories of love and the bitter truth of betrayal. By the end of this chapter in the investigation, the story had shifted entirely. What began as a mysterious disappearance was now a haunting tale of control, manipulation, and betrayal within the closest bonds of family. The community no longer wondered if she had left willingly. They questioned how long the storm had been brewing behind closed doors. The case had reached a threshold where the truth could no longer be contained. The next chapter would not only uncover the final pieces of the puzzle, but also reveal whether justice could ever match the weight of the betrayal. The world waited for the answer, but the family, shattered beyond recognition, already knew one truth. Life could never return to what it had been before that fateful dinner. And so the search pressed on, with only one question echoing louder than all others. If the husband's carefully constructed facade had finally cracked, what more would they find hidden beneath? The courtroom was silent when the jury returned with their verdict. Months of speculation, media frenzy, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. The family, broken by grief and betrayal, sat in heavy silence, awaiting the words that would decide the fate of the man once considered the center of their household. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no outburst, no dramatic collapse, only a suffocating stillness that filled every corner of the room. Justice had spoken, but justice never comes without its own cost. The evidence had been overwhelming. The financial records showing debts hidden from his wife, the phone data proving his late-night trips, the forensic evidence that had survived despite his meticulous efforts. It painted a picture not of a random tragedy, but of a calculated act fueled by selfish motives. A man willing to erase the woman who had stood beside him for decades, all to free himself from the weight of responsibility. The jury had no doubt, and neither did the family who had once prayed they were wrong. The sentencing brought closure, but it also brought new wounds. The children were left with the unthinkable reality that their father was not only guilty of taking their mother's life, but also guilty of tearing apart everything she had built for them. The home they grew up in became a crime scene in memory. The family photographs became fragments of a lie, and every birthday, every holiday, became a reminder of what had been stolen. The world saw a monster in handcuffs, but they saw the man who had tucked them into bed as children. That duality would haunt them for years. The case made headlines far beyond their town. It was dissected on podcasts, debated on television, and turned into documentaries. But the sensationalism could never capture the raw pain of those left behind. The story was shocking, but the truth was heartbreakingly ordinary, domestic betrayal disguised beneath the veneer of normal family life. For the investigators, it was one of those cases that lingered long after the files were closed. For the community, it was a chilling reminder that darkness could exist behind the most well-kept lawns and smiling family dinners. The mother who vanished after dinner was no longer just a headline. She became a symbol of resilience for women silenced by control, a reminder that even in tragedy, truth finds its way to the surface. Friends and neighbors gathered to honor her memory, not with whispers about how she died, but with stories of how she lived. Her laughter, her generosity, her quiet sacrifices, those were the memories they chose to keep alive. The family, fractured as it was, found solace in those memories too, slowly piecing together a future that no longer included her but was still shaped by her influence. The youngest daughter, once unable to accept the truth, began to speak publicly about her mother's story. She stood before audiences and told them that evil does not always arrive in the form of strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you trust. Her courage turned her grief into something larger than herself. The sons, though less vocal, carried their mother's legacy in quieter ways, raising their children with the love and tenderness she had once given them. The cycle of harm had ended, but the cycle of love endured. The case file was eventually closed, but its lessons were not forgotten. For law enforcement, it was proof of how persistence in investigation can break through even the most carefully constructed lies. For the community, it was a sobering lesson about the fragile nature of safety within the walls of a family home. For the audience who followed the case from afar, it was a story that forced uncomfortable questions. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? What masks can ordinary lives conceal? As the years passed, the story lived on in articles, documentaries, and retellings, but for those who loved her, she was not just a victim. She was a mother who had once braided her daughter's hair, who had stayed up late helping with school projects, who had hosted dinners filled with laughter and warmth. That was her truth, the truth no act of violence could ever erase. And in the end, despite the horror, despite the betrayal, it was her presence, her memory, that remained stronger than the man who tried to erase her. She was the heart of her family, and even in her absence, she continued to guide them forward. The justice system had delivered its verdict, but it was the love she left behind that became the real victory. The story of the mother who vanished after dinner closed with answers, but no one could call it a happy ending. It was a tale carved in grief, sealed in betrayal, and remembered in resilience. A reminder that true crime is never just about crime. It is about people, about the lives shattered, about the silence left behind when a voice is taken too soon. And so, as the world moved on, the family held on to what mattered most, her memory. That was the one thing her disappearance could never take away. This was the haunting story of the mother who vanished after dinner. A case that began with an ordinary evening meal and unraveled into a tragedy that shocked a family, a community, and the world beyond. It reminds us that sometimes the most chilling mysteries don't begin with strangers in the dark, but with secrets hiding in plain sight. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories told with the depth and detail they deserve. Share your thoughts in the comments. How did this case make you feel, and what lessons do you take from it? Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones closest to home.